Good afternoon. My name is Doug Lamalice. I'm from Katoleche First Nation Reserve, right across the Hay River here. I was born and raised there. I was born May 22nd, 1962 in the H. Williams Memorial Hospital. I grew up going to school in the town of Hay River. We lived in a small 16 by 20 house, with an extension. So there was 5 of us and my mother and father in that home. And I had a hard time keeping focus on who I am as a very young person. The house was always busy. We always had potatoes to plant and pull in the fall. We had horses all the time growing up for the work that needed to be done within the community, hauling garbage and hauling water to provide to the homes. So my father contracted that with the government at that time because there was no road going from Hay River to Katoleche First Nation. So I grew up going to school in the town of Hay River, in the old town, with my sister Dorothy. And there was no buses, no truck. My brother went to work early, so we had to walk from our home to the school in the old town, Federal Day School, which was Campsel St. Paul, it was later called. And it was a good 2-mile walk in the morning and in the afternoon. It was always cold, it was always dark. It seemed like it was always -40 when we were walking, or anytime we're doing anything during that time in our lives. Temperature is much different today, it's much warmer. We're lucky if we get -27. And that kind of changed for my father because we were used to the temperatures that were really low, -40, -50, it made the fur prime. So my father depended on that fur to be prime. So now trappers have a hard time getting high quality furs because of the temperature, because of the mildness makes the furs very not worth it. So as I was growing up, going to school, it was difficult, but at the same time, my mother required it. She wanted it, and that's all there was to it. So it was tough going to school, being the only 2 Aboriginal kids within the school, but we managed, and to this day, I still have friends that are like my brothers and sisters from that school and in my life. So I would work ahead in school so I can go trapping with my father. My 2 brothers were always busy working and providing for the household, and then eventually working into their own families. So my mother always told me, well, you know, your father wants you to help him with the trap line, he wants you to help him with the fish camps in the fall, which is what's going on right now. So I'd work ahead in school and I'd go to the fish camps. But I learned a lot there. I learned a lot there from hunting with my father, from getting the fish ready on the stage, it's called. So when we had dog food, that was the dog food. There would be 10 fish on one willow stick and then hung up on maybe a 12-foot stage where they would be covered with a net for birding. No birds allowed, and it would just be 4 poles sticking up out of the ground onto the racks where they laid the hung fish. So we would hang that fish for the winter months for the dogs. So as soon as the ice formed and as soon as the dogs could pull sleighs, we would go to Fish Point and pick up the fish and load it up in the sleighs and come back. So that would have to happen quite a few times. So we did that, and during that time of hunting and fishing, We did a lot of our hunting in the fall when the birds were going south. My father explained that they had to have the fresh geese and ducks because they were born and raised within our territory here, where we know the land is fresh and everything is clean. So it was important that we got those animals and those birds so they would be free of any toxins or anything that they could come across if they were coming from the south. So growing up in the community was beautiful. I never thought for one moment that we were without and we weren't getting by very good. We always had lots of food. We always had lots of fish, lots of moose meat. My mom worked full time, so she always bought groceries until everybody started getting older and I'd work after school, and so I could supply money for groceries for my mom and dad. Now, as I was growing up, like I said, I would come home from school and then I have to do all the dirty water from the house. I'd have to do all the rabbit feeding. I'd have to do all the duck feeding. I'd have to clean up the horses. I had to start storing potatoes with my mother so we could have potatoes all winter. So 2-3 hours a day after school, I'd have to do that, and I never realized how much work we were doing. It was just part of our lives, and it was just something that we did, and there was no complaints, and we weren't allowed to complain. So every time my dad would go hunting in the spring or in the fall, for each hunt, the spring hunt or the fall hunt, my father would go out with his brothers and other community members, and they'd go out on the land towards Fish Point, towards Buffalo Lake, and they'd haul back 4 moose, maybe. And my mother and father would cut up all that moose meat, and my sister and I had to haul it all over in Old Village. She provided potatoes to them, onions, and moose meat. So in those days, there was no exhausts, there was no pollution. Everything was so fresh smelling. So I think about it now, and I thought about it for the last 10, 20 years of the smells that I used to have as a younger child growing up in the Old Village. Once that meat was distributed and all the potatoes and onions were distributed to all the homes, you could smell the food cooking within all the homes. So I could walk outside my home from my mom's cooking, and I could smell all the cooking from the Old Village. To me, when I think about it now, it was such a blessing, and it was such a beautiful thing that my father and mother did. So once they'd pass out all the meat, my mom would say, well, what about us? What about, where's our meat? So my dad would say, well, I'll go back hunting. So he'd go back and get a couple more moose, and that would be providing for the family. And there we would make dry meat. We would smoke a lot of the meat because we had no fridges. And we'd always go to a place called Potato Hill. It was in the Old Village. It was a crib house built under the ground with earth on top. So in the winter time, we would haul big chunks of blocked ice into that crib, into that Potato Hill. And then during the summer, well, we had a fridge then. So we had some place to store everything that was like a fridge. It was cold. We had ice in there, and all summer long, the ice would slowly melt, but not very fast. So we had all our potatoes, our onions, our carrots, our smoked meat in stacks, in cheesecloth, wrapped up. And to me, we had to go to our Potato Hill, and we'd have to get groceries every now and then. Other than the groceries in Hay River, we still liked our chicken and pork chops and everything. But my father always said, don't eat out of the grocery stores so much. And now I know what he meant. I always thought, well, why can't we eat out of the grocery stores? He wanted pure food. They wanted pure fish, pure moose meat. They didn't want anything that was chemically induced or anything that would go into our systems. So you see a lot of our elders, and my father passed away when he was 94. So a lot of the elders lived to a longer age. They lived longer, they had more traditional teachings and cultural teachings to pass on to me and whoever in the community that wanted it. So there was times when there'd be funerals and, we'd be told, go and sit with that family as younger people, teenagers growing up. He'd say, go and sit with that family, but you can't be loud, you can't laugh and joke around, you can't make it like it's a fun occasion. You have to go there and just be in support and just be there with the family. So we had different rules that we had to follow during that time. We weren't allowed to sing, we weren't allowed to whistle at night, we weren't allowed to cry at night, because they wanted that family to become stronger during their difficult time. And my father would come to that home and he'd sit with him and he'd talk with the elderly couple that had a loss or something. So growing up, that was very difficult times for me and for my family because we all come from one community. Everybody knows every single soul in that community and their kids. So if something happened within the community, everybody felt it. Everybody had to go through the pain and the sadness and the sorrow of losing another person. My father would always say, my children, you're all fine right now. He'd always say that, we're all okay right now. He'd say, how are we going to be at that time? He never said when this happens. He said, how are we going to be at that time? How are we going to act? How are we going to continue on? How is our family going to survive and be okay about what's going on? So he was always thinking ahead for us on what's actually could and is going to happen. So I have a family of 5. We're down to 3. So I've gone through quite a few losses in my community. I had a niece lost. I had 3 nieces lost, and I had 1 nephew lost. And I'm 63 years old. So I always thought they would be the ones saying goodbye to me. But it works out, and it worked out that I'm saying goodbye to them. And that was really tough on me because that's not the way it was supposed to be. It was supposed to be that they lived and conducted their lives in a way where the parents had taught them and the grandparents had taught them, so they could become knowledge keepers to pass on information of who we are as Dene people. If we don't pass on our information, then we have wasted our time. It would be all about us. I do drumming in the community. I do drumming with the community members, the drummers, and I get to do ceremonies with people, with community members, and it helps me in my life. So when we're telling the children, okay, pay attention because we're doing this today, but you'll be doing it tomorrow when we're not here. So as I'm growing up in school, as I'm working ahead in my teenage years, I was taught to work hard. We were all taught to work hard. So we all had a lot of work within our lives to make money. So eventually we got to the point, and we're at the point where our life has changed. We got power in 1973. Until then, there was no power. There was gas lamps and stoves, just airtight in our home. And my father would make eggs and make toast over top of the fire before we went to school on a daily basis. So we had no fridge, so we couldn't save cheese or butter or anything, milk. Everything had to be used up immediately, otherwise it went bad within the home. So we grew up strong and we grew up hard, but we always loved the way we were growing up. Not once did I hear any of my family members say, you know, this is not right, this is not the way to do it. I'm not happy. We had a little TV my brother bought for us when we were probably 9 years old. And there was the CBC from 7 o'clock to 11 o'clock nightly. So we had no power, so my brother bought a battery, and he had 2 clamps with a little wire going up to the TV so we could watch TV. So every 2 weeks, he'd have to bring the battery in when he went to work in the morning and then come back, and so we could watch TV again. You know, and back then it was something that nobody did. There was no power, so there's just no TV, no nothing. But they provided the TV for us. And it helped us learn. And that's what helped me to learn to cook, was watching TV shows after school. You know, there's Galloping Gourmet, Walk with Jan, there's all those. When I was growing up after school, I always was intently watching those cooking shows, which eventually brought spices into my life, like garlic and seasoning salts. Other than that, it was just salt and pepper. So I learned a lot from the television. I learned to watch the news. I learned to watch what was going on in the real world. We were always having floods and high water every spring from the Hay River going out into Tucho, Great Slave Lake. And we never had radios, we never had safety within the community. We always just went to the riverbank and watched the ice and how it was acting. And to me, that was scary. You know, today now we have municipal workers from Hay River and the reserve all working together, and we all know they got cameras up at Lamalice, at Alexander Falls. They got cameras everywhere, so we know what's coming down. Whereas before it was just whatever hit, whenever, and how we should be prepared. So everything always had to be 5 feet off the ground. You know, we had to have all the dogs loose if the water started rushing up. My mom still told me stories before she passed on about how the flood in '62 came. And I was only 9 months old. So at that time, she had blankets and everything in the boat. She just threw everybody in the boat, and then we just went swishing out towards Great Slave Lake across the portage on the road to Sandy Creek. So we were safe from that. So we lost a lot of dogs. We lost a lot of important things in our lives. We grow up with memorabilia from our lives that have been with us forever. And then when that happens, the water picks it up and just carries it away. And it's a sad thing, but that just goes to show how much we have to respect nature. How much our elders have told us how we have to pray and ask for protection and guidance within our family and within our communities. And the elders were always the one to do that. So the elders today still teach that knowledge and tradition of our Dene ways, of how to respect the land, how to respect the animals, how to raise your children so they're in respect of everything also. When we were first growing up, everything depended on the land and how we had to humble ourselves and how we had to pray in order to get our food from the bush. Today we can go to a grocery store and get food, but back then you had to develop those ways growing up of how to pray, how to ask for blessings such as moose and caribou and fish. Fish is so plentiful in Tucho, the Great Slave Lake. It's so deep and so vast. Fish is just, when we came out of the bush for the 3 months of being on our hunting grounds, that which is now Wood Buffalo National Park, but is Buffalo Lake where we grew up. We'd come out for 3 months and there'd be dances, weddings, funerals, celebration. It was a time of celebration. So if you met somebody and you fell in love, well, you'd have to wait 9 months to get a hold of them. You couldn't just call and say, hey, you had to live through the winter with your family. And who knows how many winters that was until you were finally ready to take a wife. You had to be a hunter, you had to be a provider, you had to be good in the bush to get your wood, you had to maintain your home, start a home, build a home with logs, whatever it took. And then you would take a wife. Until then, you weren't allowed to. So growing up on the land and with the land and needing the animals for food and sustenance, we had no way other than to live by the guidelines of how the Creator put this world together for us. So that was taught to us very strongly and very deeply and with dedication from our elders, my parents, my grandparents, the elders in the community, on how to act, how to be with one another, how to be around one another, because we always had to be around one another, and to be disciplined in all that you did from morning until night. If you weren't disciplined, it meant you were going to hurt yourself, you're going to cut yourself, you're going to get yourself to the point where you're going to be a problem in the family. If you had certain jobs within your family, within your household, you had to stay strong on what work you were doing within your home. Now, if something happened to you and you cut your leg and you're at Buffalo Lake or something, chances are you're going to get infected if you're not treated properly by the elders in the community, usually the women, with healing plants and herbs to bring you back to health. But while they're doing that, all of a sudden the work that you're doing is stopped. So that's where we had a lot of problems. We weren't near hospitals. We weren't choppered out to the hospital to get work done by the doctors to bring us back to health. We had to live in that bush, and we had no choice but to learn the ways of how to treat ourselves. So we lost a lot of members from when for 63 years ago. We lost a lot of members through accidents, through, to me, not being in tune with the land. When we're in tune with the land, that means you're praying, that means you're learning about how not to make a mistake in life, because it could be brutal and could cost you your life. It meant that you had to be in a certain frame of mind all the time. There was no chance and no room for mistakes or hurting yourself or hurting another person. It was pretty strict within our community when we were growing up. We always were told by the elders in the community, okay, it's, they didn't have watches or anything. They just say the sun's going down, get home. And we couldn't say no. Mom and Dad didn't tell us to. We couldn't say that. It was, okay, and you were gone home. There was no ifs, ands, or buts. Because you wouldn't want the elder to come to the household and talk to your mom or dad about it. Okay, so thank you for the time that I'm sharing this. To me, it's very important because today's world doesn't know about the world in the past that we were raised and we lived in. So I'm very thankful to have this opportunity to be able to share some of what I learned and how I grew up. And must see for everything. And God bless you all.